USS Nimitz CVN-68. USS Nimitz CVN-68, the oldest active aircraft carrier in the fleet and the ship that gave the entire Nimitz class its name. Nimitz matters because it established the blueprint for modern American supercarriers: nuclear propulsion, long endurance, a full carrier air wing, and the ability to sustain combat air operations far from home. USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, CVN-69, USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, CVN-69, often called Ike. Eisenhower has long been one of the Navy's most heavily used operational carriers, especially in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. If Nimitz represents the birth of the class, Eisenhower represents its long-term reliability in real operations. This is the kind of carrier that shows what the Navy actually demands from a supercarrier: repeated deployments, high sortie generation, and the ability to remain relevant across changing conflicts. In many ways, Ike is less about novelty and more about consistency under pressure. USS Carl Vinson CVN-70, USS Carl Vinson CVN-70, stands out as one of the most important bridges between the older carrier fleet and the Navy's more modern air wing. Vinson became closely associated with the integration of newer platforms like the F-35C, giving it a stronger connection to the future of naval aviation than many of its sister ships. That matters because Carl Vinson shows how the U.S. Navy has adapted the Nimitz class for a new era without replacing the entire fleet overnight. It is still a classic supercarrier, but one increasingly tied to stealth aviation, networked warfare, and a more advanced carrier air wing. USS Theodore Roosevelt, CVN-71. USS Theodore Roosevelt, CVN-71, has spent much of its service life representing frontline carrier presence, especially in the Pacific. What makes Roosevelt important is not just the ship itself, but the kind of missions it reflects: sustained deployments, fast response, and visible American naval air power in strategic waters. Theodore Roosevelt represents the practical side of carrier power. It is not a theoretical platform or a reserve asset. It is the kind of ship used to shape events in real time, reminding rivals and reassuring allies that the U.S. Navy can bring air power almost anywhere it needs to. USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72. USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72, is another major pillar of the fleet and a good example of how American carrier power depends on depth, not just headline strength. The United States does not rely on one or two carriers to do everything. It relies on a rotating force that can deploy, recover, train, and re-enter service without breaking the larger system. Abraham Lincoln fits squarely into that logic. It may not always dominate the spotlight, but ships like Lincoln are exactly what allow the Navy to maintain global reach over time instead of delivering power in short, unsustainable bursts. USS George Washington, CVN-73. USS George Washington, CVN-73, is especially significant because it recently completed one of the most important events in a carrier's life cycle: refueling and complex overhaul. That process is far more than maintenance. It is what gives a nuclear carrier the second half of its service life, along with major upgrades to systems across the ship. George Washington, therefore, represents renewal. It shows how the Navy preserves carrier power, not by discarding old ships, but by rebuilding them for future relevance. In strategic terms, that is a major advantage, because replacing carriers from scratch is slow, difficult, and enormously expensive. USS John C. Stennis, CVN-74. USS John C. Stennis, CVN-74, tells a similar story, but from a different stage of the cycle. Stennis is currently deep in its own refueling and complex overhaul, which means it is not best understood as a deployable frontline carrier right now. but as a long-term investment in future fleet strength. That makes Stennis important, even when it is not at sea. It is a reminder that carrier power is not just about the ships people see sailing in formation. It is also about industrial capacity, shipyard timelines, reactor refueling, and the quiet work required to keep a carrier force alive for decades. USS Harry S. Truman, CVN-75. USS Harry S. Truman, CVN-75, has become one of the most recognizable examples of an active operational carrier in recent years. Truman represents what carrier power looks like when it is repeatedly used in the real world: extended deployments, high readiness, and fast repositioning across major theaters. In many ways, Truman embodies the practical value of the U.S. carrier fleet more clearly than almost any other ship. It is not just a symbol of power. It is a ship that has repeatedly been part of the Navy's day-to-day answer to global instability, especially when visible and credible force is needed quickly. USS Ronald Reagan, CVN-76. USS Ronald Reagan, CVN-76, is one of the most politically important carriers of the modern era because of its long connection to American forward presence in the Indo-Pacific. For years, Reagan was central to the visible carrier presence the United States maintained in Asia, where time, distance, and deterrence all matter enormously. That role gave the ship a strategic identity larger than its hull number. Reagan became associated not just with fleet operations, but with the message that the U.S. Navy intended to remain present in the Western Pacific, close enough to matter if tensions rose suddenly. USS George H.W. Bush, CVN-77. USS George H.W. Bush, CVN-77, is the final ship of the Nimitz class, and because of that, it can be seen as the most refined version of a design that shaped American carrier power for decades. Bush represents the end point of an era. By the time this ship entered service, the Navy had already spent generations learning how to improve survivability, air wing integration, maintenance planning, and global carrier operations. So while George H.W. Bush still belongs to the same class as Nimitz, it also represents the most mature version of that lineage before the fleet began transitioning toward an entirely new class. USS Gerald R. Ford, CVN-78. That next era begins with USS Gerald R. Ford, CVN-78. Ford is not simply another supercarrier with a new name. It is the lead ship of a new class designed to modernize how the carrier itself works, with a different approach to launch and recovery systems, internal efficiency, and sortie generation. In simple terms, Gerald R. Ford is the Navy's attempt to preserve the strategic value of the aircraft carrier while redesigning the ship for 21st century operations. If the Nimitz class represents the proven backbone of American sea-based air power, Ford represents the Navy's belief that the carrier still has a future, but that future requires smarter systems, faster operations, and a more advanced air warfare platform. If the U.S. Navy dropped below 11 aircraft carriers, what do you think would be affected first? Global presence, deterrence, or crisis response? I would love to hear your take. Subscribe Defense Theory for more military explainers.